Everyone laughed when the feared Korean Mafia boss chose a quiet, ordinary woman instead of someone rich, influential, or admired by society's standards. They whispered that she would never survive his world, that she would either run away or lose herself beneath the weight of his name. His relatives mocked him behind closed doors, while business associates predicted the marriage would end before the first anniversary. But years later, while those same people were trapped inside lonely mansions, broken relationships, and endless regret, the man they once feared was waking every morning to the laughter of children, the warmth of genuine love, and a home filled with peace. What nobody understood was that the woman they underestimated possessed something no fortune, beauty, or power could ever replace: a heart capable of healing the darkest soul. If you love Korean billionaire romance and mafia love stories like this, subscribe now to Official_Threads and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. There was a time when people believed Kang Min-jae had everything. He owned luxurious hotels across Asia, controlled influential businesses, and carried a reputation that made even powerful executives lower their voices whenever his name was mentioned. Newspapers called him a mysterious billionaire. Rivals secretly referred to him as the king of Seoul's underground empire. His enemies feared him, while his allies respected the discipline that had built his empire. But behind the expensive suits and intimidating reputation was a man who had forgotten what genuine happiness felt like. Years of betrayal had hardened him. The people he trusted the most had traded loyalty for money. The woman he once intended to marry had chosen another man after deciding power mattered more than love. Even members of his own family only visited him whenever they wanted something. His mansion was enormous. Every room sparkled with perfection. Every hallway echoed with silence. Despite employing dozens of workers, the place never felt like a home. It felt like a museum where emotions had been locked away. Every morning followed the same routine: meetings, contracts, business dinners, endless decisions. Then another lonely night. Even during family gatherings, Min-jae rarely smiled. His relatives mistook his silence for arrogance, never realizing that disappointment had slowly replaced every dream he once carried. His grandmother often watched him from across the dining table. Unlike everyone else, she remembered the cheerful grandson who once laughed at simple jokes and dreamed about having a wife who loved him for who he was instead of what he owned. One evening, she quietly placed a cup of tea before him. "You built an empire," she said softly. "But when was the last time you built a memory?" Min-jae looked at the steaming cup without answering. Her words stayed with him much longer than he expected. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, another life moved at a completely different pace. Nia Mensa had never imagined wealth would solve every problem. Growing up in Ghana before moving to South Korea on a cultural exchange scholarship, she had learned that dignity often mattered more than comfort. She believed kindness should never depend on someone's status. After finishing school, she chose to remain in Seoul. Not because life was easy, because she had fallen in love with its quiet mornings, blooming cherry blossoms, and the belief that every difficult season eventually came to an end. She worked several jobs over the years, sometimes at a bookstore, sometimes translating English documents, sometimes helping elderly neighbors with errands. Wherever she worked, people remembered the same thing. She listened before speaking. She noticed people everyone else ignored, and she always left places warmer than she found them. Still, life wasn't generous. Rent increased. Jobs disappeared. Unexpected expenses arrived without warning. Yet she refused to become bitter. Whenever someone asked why she continued smiling despite everything, she simply answered, "Peace begins inside us before it appears around us." She had no idea those words would soon change another person's life. One rainy afternoon, Nia accepted temporary work through a private staffing agency. The assignment sounded simple. A wealthy household needed someone to organize a private library, arrange historical documents, and assist the elderly grandmother who spent most of her afternoons reading. The pay was better than anything she had earned before. She accepted immediately. When the black luxury car stopped before the towering iron gates of the Kong estate, she couldn't hide her surprise. The mansion looked more like a palace than a home. Elegant gardens stretched across the property. Tall fountains reflected the gray afternoon sky. Uniformed staff moved quietly through the grounds with remarkable discipline. Everything looked perfect. Yet somehow, everything also felt lonely. The house manager welcomed her politely before explaining several rules. The chairman dislikes unnecessary conversation. Never interrupt his work. Never enter the West Wing unless instructed. The staff finishes dinner before the family. Nia nodded carefully. She had no interest in invading anyone's privacy. She was simply grateful for the opportunity. What she didn't know was that someone had already noticed her arrival. From the second-floor office window, Min Jae watched the unfamiliar young woman walking through the garden beside his grandmother. She wasn't dressed in designer clothes. She wore no expensive jewelry. Instead, she admired the flowers blooming along the stone pathway as though they were treasures. His grandmother laughed at something she said. That alone surprised him. The old woman hadn't laughed that freely in months. "Who is she?" he asked the house manager later. "A temporary assistant for Madam." He nodded without another question. Temporary. She would leave soon like everyone else. Or so he believed. During the following days, Nia quietly settled into the mansion. She organized thousands of books with incredible patience. She labeled handwritten journals dating back decades. She even repaired several damaged family photo albums after asking permission. One afternoon, while dusting an old bookshelf, she discovered dozens of framed family photographs tucked away inside a storage cabinet. Some showed little Min Jae smiling beside his parents. Others captured birthday celebrations, vacations, and joyful moments that no longer existed. She gently cleaned each frame before placing them where sunlight could reach them. When the grandmother entered the room later that afternoon, tears filled her eyes. "I haven't seen these displayed in years. They deserve to be remembered," Nia replied softly. "Beautiful memories shouldn't stay hidden." Upstairs, Min Jae unexpectedly walked into the library. His eyes immediately landed on the photographs. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Then his expression hardened. "Who moved these?" The room fell silent. Several employees nervously looked toward Nia. She stepped forward calmly. "I did." His cold gaze settled on her. "You were instructed to organize books." "I was. Not rearrange personal belongings." "I understand. Then why ignore instructions?" Instead of panicking, she answered honestly. "I wasn't trying to ignore them. I noticed your grandmother smiling while looking through these photographs." She paused before continuing. "I thought perhaps this house missed remembering happier days." The words hung quietly between them. Several workers expected Min Jae to dismiss her immediately. No one had ever spoken to him that directly. He stared at her expression. There was no fear, no attempt to impress him, only sincerity. Without another word, he turned and walked away. The employees released nervous sighs. One whispered, "You'll probably be gone before tomorrow." Nia simply smiled. "If I did something wrong, I'll apologize." That evening, Min Jae couldn't concentrate on work. Again and again, his thoughts returned to the photographs, now standing proudly inside the library. For years he had avoided looking at them because they reminded him of everything he had lost. Yet somehow, seeing them again didn't only bring pain. It also reminded him that happiness had once existed. Meanwhile, downstairs, his grandmother quietly thanked Nia. "You've done something no one else has managed." "I only moved a few photographs." The elderly woman smiled knowingly. "No. You reminded my grandson that before he became feared, he was loved." Neither of them realized someone standing outside the partially open door had heard every single word. Min Jae remained frozen in the hallway. For the first time in many years, someone had looked beyond his reputation and seen the lonely man hiding beneath it. And although he refused to admit it, something inside his guarded heart had shifted ever so slightly. What neither of them knew was that this small moment, one shelf of forgotten photographs and one honest conversation, would become the first thread in a love story that everyone else believed could never exist, and the beginning of a family that would one day make the entire city question what true wealth really meant. The following morning, the Kong mansion felt different. Nothing had changed on the outside. The marble floors still reflected the morning sunlight. Staff members still moved through the hallways with perfect discipline. Security guards remained at every entrance. Min Jae still left for his meetings wearing a tailored black suit that matched his cold expression. Yet something inside the house had quietly begun to change. As he walked toward the front entrance, Min Jae noticed fresh flowers arranged beside the staircase. They weren't expensive imported roses that decorators usually ordered. They were simple seasonal flowers picked from the estate's own garden. He paused for only a second. The colors somehow softened the room. The house manager smiled politely. Miss Nia suggested using flowers from the garden instead of buying new ones every week. Madam said the house feels more alive this way. Min Jae gave a small nod before walking away. He refused to admit that he agreed. Meanwhile, Nia spent the morning helping Min Jae's grandmother prepare tea on the back terrace. The elderly woman watched birds gathering around the garden fountain and sighed happily. "This mansion used to sound like this every day," she whispered. "Children laughed here. Family meals lasted for hours. My husband loved filling every room with music." She looked toward the massive building behind them. "Now everyone only talks about money." Nia gently poured more tea into her cup. "Sometimes a house only needs one person willing to love it again." The older woman smiled. "And I think that person has already arrived." Nia laughed softly. "I only organize books." "No," the grandmother replied. "You organize hearts without realizing it." Those words stayed with Nia throughout the day. She had never imagined that simple acts of kindness could mean so much. Meanwhile, Min Jae found himself unusually distracted during an important board meeting. Executives argued over investments worth millions. Normally, he would have corrected every mistake immediately. Instead, his thoughts drifted toward the mansion, toward the library, toward the young woman who had somehow challenged years of silence without raising her voice. His assistant noticed. "Chairman Kong, are you feeling unwell?" Min Jae looked up. "No." But even he wasn't convinced by his answer. That evening, he returned home much earlier than usual. As he entered the dining room, he expected the familiar silence. Instead, he heard laughter. Not loud laughter. Gentle laughter. His grandmother and Nia were trying to bake traditional Korean pastries together. Flour covered the kitchen counter. One pastry had come out completely misshapen. The grandmother couldn't stop laughing. "I'm afraid we've invented a brand new recipe." Nia covered her face, laughing with embarrassment. "I promise I'm much better at organizing libraries than baking." Neither woman noticed Min Jae standing quietly at the doorway. He couldn't remember the last time he had heard genuine laughter inside his home. For reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't want to interrupt it. His grandmother finally noticed him. "Min Jae, come taste one." "I'm busy." "You've been busy for 10 years. He almost answered with another excuse. Instead, he reluctantly walked over. Nia nervously handed him one of the pastries. "I'm sorry if it's terrible." He took one careful bite. The pastry was slightly burned. The filling was uneven. It was far from perfect. Yet, it tasted better than the expensive desserts his private chefs prepared every day, because someone had made it with care. Without realizing it, the corner of his mouth lifted ever so slightly. His grandmother gasped dramatically. He smiled. Nia looked up in surprise. For a brief second, their eyes met. Neither of them spoke, but something gentle passed between them. It disappeared almost as quickly as it came. Still, both of them felt it. Days slowly turned into weeks. The temporary job that was supposed to last only 14 days quietly became a month. No one objected, especially Min Jae's grandmother. One afternoon, Nia found several employees nervously cleaning the children's playroom. She looked around in confusion. "There aren't any children here." One elderly housekeeper sighed sadly. "There used to be." She quickly stopped herself. "I shouldn't have said anything." Later that evening, curiosity led Nia to ask the grandmother. The old woman's eyes became distant. "Years ago, my son dreamed that one day this house would be filled with grandchildren." She smiled sadly. "But after he passed away, Min Jae buried that dream." "He never wanted a family?" "Oh, he wanted one." She looked toward the dark hallway. "He simply stopped believing he deserved one." Those words broke Nia's heart. She suddenly understood why every room felt so carefully maintained, yet emotionally empty. The mansion had been prepared for a future that never arrived. But what she didn't know was that someone had quietly overheard their conversation. Min Jae stood outside once again. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even surprised. He simply realized that Nia was slowly discovering the truth he spent years hiding from everyone else. A few days later, rain poured across Seoul. Most employees hurried indoors. Nia noticed one elderly gardener struggling to move heavy flower pots before the storm became worse. Without hesitation, she ran outside. Together they carried every plant beneath shelter. By the time they finished, she was completely soaked. Min Jae happened to arrive home just then. He stepped out of his car and immediately saw her shivering in the rain. "What are you doing?" he asked. She looked up, surprised. "They would have been ruined." "They're flowers." She smiled. "They're alive." He stared at her for several seconds. Most people protected expensive things. She protected living things. There was a difference. Without saying another word, he removed his long coat and placed it over her shoulders. The staff froze. No one had ever seen Chairman Kong do something so thoughtful. Even Nia looked shocked. "You'll catch a cold," she whispered. "So will you." It was only 4 words. Yet they echoed through the mansion for days. That evening, rumors quietly spread among relatives. The chairman had given his own coat to a temporary assistant. His aunt laughed dismissively. "It means nothing." His cousin smirked. "He's probably just being polite." But another relative wasn't so certain. "I've never seen him notice anyone before." Meanwhile, Min-jae couldn't understand his own actions. He had simply reacted. Seeing her standing alone in the cold rain had felt wrong. For years he had convinced himself that emotions only made people vulnerable. Yet lately, he found himself paying attention to little things. Whether she had eaten lunch, whether she looked tired, whether she smiled that day. He tried convincing himself it meant nothing. But his heart had already started arguing with his mind. One quiet evening, Nia wandered into the music room while returning a stack of books. A beautiful grand piano stood beneath a large window, untouched. She gently brushed the dust from the keys. "I didn't know anyone played." A familiar voice answered behind her. "My mother did." She turned to find Min-jae standing nearby. "I'm sorry. You don't need to apologize." He slowly walked toward the piano. After she died, he rested one hand against the polished wood. No one touched it again. Silence settled between them. Then Nia asked softly, "If she could see this room now, do you think she'd want it to stay silent forever?" He looked at her. She continued carefully. "Sometimes keeping everything untouched isn't honoring someone's memory. It's hiding from it." Those words struck deeper than she realized. For years, he had mistaken grief for loyalty. Maybe he had simply been afraid to live again. Nia carefully sat at the piano. "I'm not very good." She played a gentle melody she remembered from childhood. The notes weren't perfect. Some keys came slightly late. Yet the music carried warmth the silent room had lacked for years. Min-jae closed his eyes. For the first time since losing his parents, the mansion no longer felt haunted by memories. It felt hopeful. As the final note faded into silence, neither of them noticed the grandmother watching quietly from the doorway. Tears filled her eyes. She whispered to herself, "This house is finally breathing again." But while peace slowly found its way into the Kong mansion, whispers outside its walls were growing louder. Relatives had begun asking uncomfortable questions. Business partners wondered why the feared mafia boss seemed happier. And among those who had always hoped to control his future, jealousy was quietly beginning to bloom. None of them realized that the quiet woman they continued to underestimate was already changing not only Min-jae's life, but the destiny of the entire Kong family. And the next chapter of their journey would test whether a love built on kindness could withstand the weight of pride, prejudice, and impossible expectations. The weeks that followed brought a kind of peace the Kong mansion had not experienced in decades. For the first time in years, the dining table was used every evening instead of only during formal occasions. Min-jae no longer ate alone in his office while reading financial reports. His grandmother insisted that everyone shared dinner together, and although he protested at first, he eventually gave in. At first, the conversations were awkward. His grandmother talked enough for 3 people, while Min-jae answered with only a few words. Nia simply listened, occasionally asking simple questions that somehow encouraged both of them to open up. What was Chairman Kong like as a child? His grandmother laughed immediately. He cried every time he lost a board game. Min-jae nearly choked on his tea. "I was 7, and you refused to speak to your grandfather for an entire afternoon." Nia smiled. So the fearless Chairman Kong once lost an argument to a chessboard. For a brief moment, Min-jae looked as though he wanted to defend himself. Instead, he laughed. Not loudly, just enough to surprise everyone at the table. The servants quietly exchanged amazed glances. Some had worked there for over 15 years. None of them had ever heard him laugh. Meanwhile, outside the mansion, the rumors continued to spread. Every major family connected to the Kong Empire had expected Min-jae to marry someone who could strengthen business alliances. Instead, he seemed to be spending more time with an ordinary African woman who had entered the mansion as temporary staff. To many people, that simply didn't make sense. His aunt, Madame Seo, was especially displeased. She had spent years introducing wealthy daughters from influential families to Min-jae. Every invitation had been politely rejected. Now she couldn't accept that the one woman who had captured his attention possessed neither wealth nor status. During one family gathering, she finally confronted his grandmother. "I hear the assistant is still living here." She's helping me. For 2 months. The grandmother smiled calmly. Good people are difficult to replace. Madame Co lowered her voice. People are beginning to talk. They've always talked. This time they're laughing. The older woman looked directly into her eyes. People who spend their lives laughing at others rarely notice how empty their own homes have become. Madame Co forced a smile. But inside, her pride had been wounded. She quietly decided that if Min Jae wouldn't end this unusual friendship himself, someone else would. A few days later, the mansion prepared for its annual charity gala. It was the one evening each year when politicians, business leaders, celebrities, and influential families gathered under one roof. Every detail had to be perfect. Staff members hurried through the hallways making final preparations. Decorators filled the ballroom with elegant white flowers. Crystal chandeliers illuminated every corner. As everyone worked, Min Jae noticed Nia carrying heavy boxes of children's books toward the charity display. Without thinking, he walked over. I'll help. She blinked in surprise. You don't have to. I know. He lifted the boxes anyway. Several employees stopped working. They had never seen the chairman carry anything for another person. One young employee whispered, "Is that really Chairman Kong?" Another smiled. "I think he's changing." Neither of them realized Min Jae had overheard. For once, he didn't mind. That evening, guests began arriving in elegant gowns and tailored tuxedos. Luxury cars lined the entrance. Camera flashes illuminated the night. Nia had planned to stay in the background, helping organize donations. She wore a simple navy blue evening dress provided by the staff coordinator. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't covered in diamonds. Yet its elegance perfectly matched her quiet confidence. As she entered the ballroom, conversations gradually slowed. Some guests looked curious. Others looked confused. Madame Co immediately recognized an opportunity. She approached Nia with a smile that appeared warm but carried hidden cruelty. "My dear," she said sweetly, "you've done such wonderful work around the house." "Thank you. I'm sure all this luxury must feel overwhelming." Nia answered politely. "It's beautiful." Madame Co laughed softly. "I suppose people from humble backgrounds rarely experience evenings like this." Several nearby guests smiled awkwardly. The insult was subtle, but impossible to miss. For a brief moment, silence settled around them. Everyone waited to see how Nia would respond. She smiled gently. "I've learned something interesting." Madame Co raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "A beautiful room isn't created by expensive decorations." She looked around the ballroom before continuing. "It's created by the kindness of the people inside it." The smile on Madame Co's face slowly disappeared. Several guests lowered their eyes in embarrassment. Even those who had secretly judged Nia couldn't deny the grace with which she had answered. At that exact moment, Min Jae entered the ballroom. He hadn't heard the beginning of the conversation, but he had heard the ending. Without hesitation, he walked directly toward Nia. Then, in front of every guest, he offered her his arm. "Would you walk with me?" The ballroom became completely silent. Nia hesitated. "Are you sure? I've never been more certain." She gently placed her hand on his arm. Together they walked through the center of the ballroom. Not as chairman and assistant. Not as billionaire and ordinary woman. Simply, as two people who respected one another. Across the room, whispers erupted. Some guests looked shocked. Others smiled quietly. His grandmother watched with tears in her eyes. For years she had prayed that her grandson would someday stop caring about appearances. Tonight, her prayer had finally been answered. As the evening continued, donations exceeded every previous record. Children's hospitals received millions in support. Scholarship programs expanded. Community centers gained new funding. Reporters praised the event as the most heartfelt gala the Kong family had ever hosted. Later that night, after the final guests had left, Min Jae found Nia standing alone in the garden beneath the glowing lanterns. "You handled yourself well tonight." She smiled faintly. "I've heard worse." "You shouldn't have to." She looked toward the stars. "People judge what they don't understand." He stood beside her in comfortable silence. After several moments, he finally spoke. "When everyone else saw my reputation, you saw my loneliness." She slowly turned toward him. "And when everyone looked at me, you saw a person." He nodded. "I did." For the first time in years, Min Jae allowed himself to be completely honest. "I've spent so long protecting my heart that I forgot how to live." His voice softened. "Then you walked into my grandmother's library. And somehow, you made this house feel like home again." Nia's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't plan any of this. I know. Sometimes the most important people enter our lives quietly. The gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers through the garden. Neither of them noticed the grandmother watching from a nearby window, smiling to herself. She whispered softly, "Your parents would be so proud." Months passed. Nia's temporary contract officially ended. The house manager approached her with the paperwork. "We'll understand if you choose another opportunity." Before she could answer, another voice interrupted. "There won't be another opportunity." Everyone turned toward Min Jae. He looked directly at Nia. "I have something else to ask." The room became perfectly still. His heart pounded harder than it ever had during any business negotiation. He took one slow step forward, then another. Finally, he stood before the woman who had quietly transformed his life. "I've spent years building companies. I've built influence. I've built wealth." He smiled gently. "But I've never built the one thing that truly matters." He reached into his jacket, not for an extravagant display, but for a small velvet box that had belonged to his late mother. Holding it carefully, he said, "Nia Minsa, will you help me build a family instead?" Tears streamed down Nia's face before she could even speak. Around them, the mansion that had once echoed with silence now seemed to hold its breath. And although love had finally found its voice, neither of them could imagine just how deeply that single question would change not only their own future, but the lives of everyone who had ever doubted that true happiness could be built on kindness rather than status. Their answer would mark the beginning of a new chapter, one far more beautiful than either of them had ever dared to dream. Nia could barely see through the tears filling her eyes. For a long moment, she simply stared at the small velvet box resting in Min Jae's hands. It wasn't the diamonds inside that overwhelmed her. It was the meaning behind them. The man standing before her had spent years protecting himself from disappointment. He had trusted contracts more than promises, silence more than conversations, and distance more than affection. Now he was placing his future into someone else's hands. She slowly smiled through her tears. "I thought you would never ask." A nervous laugh escaped Min Jae. "So, is that a yes?" Instead of answering with words, Nia stepped forward and gently wrapped her arms around him. "Yes, I'll help you build a family." For several seconds, neither of them moved. The staff, watching from a respectful distance, quietly wiped away tears. Even the house manager, who had served the Kong family for over 30 years, smiled. "I never thought I'd see this day." Min Jae's grandmother closed her eyes in gratitude. "My grandson has finally come home." The wedding was unlike anything the media had expected. Reporters assumed the powerful Chairman Kong would host the most extravagant ceremony in South Korea. Instead, the couple chose something beautifully simple. Only close friends, loyal employees, elderly neighbors whom Nia had helped over the years, and people who had stood beside them during difficult seasons received invitations. The ceremony was held in the gardens of the Kong estate beneath rows of blooming cherry blossom trees. There were no unnecessary displays of wealth, no competition, no attempt to impress anyone, just genuine joy. When Nia walked toward the aisle in an elegant ivory dress, every guest stood. Min Jae couldn't take his eyes off her. For years, people had introduced him to famous actresses, wealthy heiresses, and influential socialites. Yet none of them had ever made his heart feel the way the quiet woman walking toward him did. As she reached him, he whispered softly, "You look beautiful." She smiled. "You've told me that every day this week." "Because it's true every day." The guests laughed gently. For the first time in many years, the Kong mansion wasn't known for power. It was known for love. Life after marriage wasn't perfect. It was real. They disagreed sometimes. Min Jae still buried himself in work whenever difficult decisions arose. Nia occasionally became frustrated when he forgot to rest. But unlike before, neither of them walked away from difficult conversations. They stayed. They listened. They apologized. They learned. One evening, Nia found him asleep at his office desk with dozens of unfinished documents scattered around him. She quietly covered him with a blanket before turning off the lights. The next morning, he found a handwritten note beside his coffee. "Your family needs your smile more than another completed report." He folded the note carefully and placed it inside his wallet. Years later, it was still there. Not long after their first anniversary, another miracle arrived. Nia gently placed Min Jae's hand against her stomach. He looked confused. Then she smiled. "I think someone wants to meet you." It took several seconds before he understood. His eyes widened. "We're..." She nodded. "We're going to be parents." For the first time since childhood, Kong Min-jae cried without trying to hide it. He knelt in front of her, resting his forehead gently against her hands. I don't know if I'll be a good father. Nia softly lifted his face. You already know how. You protect. You listen. You love. Our child won't need a perfect father. They'll need you. Months later, a beautiful baby girl entered the world. The entire mansion transformed overnight. The once silent hallways echoed with tiny cries, joyful laughter, and the excited footsteps of grandparents and staff carrying toys from room to room. Min-jae refused to let anyone else carry his daughter for long. Despite leading billion-dollar companies during the day, every evening belonged completely to his little family. He learned how to change diapers. He stayed awake through sleepless nights. He read bedtime stories with dramatic voices that made both his daughter and Nia laugh until tears filled their eyes. The employees couldn't believe the transformation. The feared mafia boss who once intimidated entire boardrooms now happily wore toy crowns during imaginary tea parties. His grandmother often smiled quietly from across the room. This, she whispered, this is the grandson I remember. A few years later, their family grew again. This time, a little boy. Unlike his quiet sister, he inherited endless curiosity. He followed Min-jae everywhere around the mansion. Dad, yes. Why do people call you scary? Min-jae looked at Nia before answering. I think they met me before I met your mother. The children laughed without fully understanding. Nia smiled because she understood completely. As the years passed, the Kong mansion became known throughout Seoul for something entirely unexpected. Not influence, not wealth, not power, but warmth. Employees celebrated birthdays together. Children from local community centers visited during holidays. Scholarship students attended family dinners each year. The Grand Library, once silent and forgotten, became a place where children gathered every weekend to read stories together. Nia personally organized reading afternoons, art classes, and mentoring programs. The mansion that once felt like a museum slowly became filled with life. One afternoon, nearly 10 years after their wedding, the family attended another charity gala. This time, their daughter proudly walked beside her father while their young son held Nia's hand. As they entered the ballroom, conversations quietly stopped. Many of the same people who had laughed years earlier were still present. Only now, everything had changed. Madame Co watched from across the room. Age had softened her confidence. Her own children rarely visited. The business alliance she once valued above family had eventually fallen apart. She slowly approached Nia. For several moments, neither woman spoke. Finally, Madame Co lowered her head. I owe you an apology. Nia looked surprised. I judged you. I thought you weren't worthy of this family. Her voice trembled. But I was wrong. She glanced toward Min-jae, laughing with their children. You didn't just marry into this family. You saved it. The ballroom grew quiet once again. Many guests remembered the cruel words spoken years ago. Now they witnessed something entirely different. Humility. Nia gently reached forward and held the older woman's hands. We all grow. Some of us simply take longer. Tears filled Madame Co's eyes. Thank you. Across the room, Min-jae watched the conversation. He realized something remarkable. The greatest victory in his life hadn't been defeating rivals or expanding his empire. It had been choosing kindness when everyone expected pride. Choosing love when everyone expected status. Choosing one extraordinary woman whom everyone else had underestimated. Later that evening, the family returned home. After putting the children to bed, Min-jae and Nia sat together on the same garden bench where so many important conversations had begun years before. The cherry blossom trees swayed gently in the evening breeze. Min-jae reached for her hand. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't accepted that temporary job? She smiled. I think about it sometimes. And I think God has a beautiful way of letting two lonely people find each other. He looked toward the brightly lit mansion. Children's drawings now decorated the hallways. Family photographs covered the walls. Laughter floated through open windows. The once empty playroom had become the children's favorite place. Even the old piano was played almost every evening. Everything he once believed impossible had become his everyday life. You know, he said quietly, people used to tell me that power was the greatest success a man could achieve. And now, he smiled at his wife, then looked toward the home they had built together. Now I know they're wrong. The greatest success is hearing our children laugh when I open the front door. Nia rested her head on his shoulder. Neither of them needed another word. Sometimes silence carried more love than any conversation ever could. Years earlier, people had laughed because the feared Korean mafia boss chose a woman they believed was too ordinary. They measured her by her background instead of her character, by her status instead of her heart. They couldn't see what Min Jae eventually discovered. Her kindness turned a mansion into a home. Her wisdom healed wounds that money never could. Her loyalty gave a lonely man the courage to love again. Together, they proved that the strongest foundations are not built with wealth, influence, or fear. They are built with trust, patience, forgiveness, and unconditional love. That became the greatest legacy of the Kong family. Not the empire they created, but the family they chose to become. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. Real love never asks where someone comes from before deciding whether they deserve happiness. It looks beyond status, beyond appearances, and beyond the opinions of the world. A loyal heart can heal years of pain. A kind word can change the direction of someone's life. And a family built on trust will always outlast one built on wealth alone. In the end, the woman everyone underestimated became the greatest blessing the most feared man had ever received. And together, they discovered that the richest people are not those who own the most, but those who have someone waiting to welcome them home. If you made it this far, let us know where you're watching from and comment your favorite moment below, like this video, and subscribe to @Physial_Threads for more emotional mafia love stories.